Minnesota, who was active in the Morrill Hall takeover and is active in the student protest movement there, and Kim Gudnestedt, a graduate of Augsburg College, giving the main speeches, with several students now studying at Augsburg responding to their addresses. So keep that date in mind, Wednesday, May 7th. Also, I'd like to remind you that the series on institutional racism, which is also a part of the Creative Dissent series, continues this afternoon at 3:30 with Mr. Milton Williams of the Way. He will concentrate this afternoon on the church, the institution church, and its involvement in racism. It's indeed a pleasure to have Mr. William Smith on our campus this morning. There are many things that I could say about Bill, but I will keep this introduction brief. He has headed up his own community organization enterprise in Minneapolis. He is now a candidate for alderman in the 5th Ward in the city of Minneapolis. As you may have noticed, there are 11 black candidates for various offices in the city of Minneapolis during the present campaign. And as I think about Bill Smith and as I have come to know him, I can only say one thing: he's exactly the kind of person that the city of Minneapolis needs on its council. Sensitive, open, honest, and aware of the fundamental issues that face this urban community. If this is an endorsement of Bill Smith, take it as such, because I would be most happy if he would be the alderman from the 5th Ward from the city of Minneapolis. After Mr. Smith's address, you will have a chance to meet him informally in conversation in the music salon and the student center from 11 to 1. Come as students and faculty and administration just to sit with Bill and ask him questions and discuss things that are of particular interest to you. This will be from 11 to 1 in the music salon. And I know that it's especially appreciative, we are, because of the busy schedule that Bill has now during the last part of his campaign. We're especially appreciative that he has given this amount of time for us here at Augsburg. Bill?
Thank you, Bill, and good morning to you all, members of the faculty, student bodies, and guests. I'm not quite so sure how this is going to come out, what I have to say. I've had about a couple of months now to prepare a presentation for you, and each weekend I said that I was going to sit down and I was going to write a very nice, well-composed presentation. And each week I had something that had to do with the campaign or something to do with some of the other matters in the city. And last night I decided that I would sit down again and I would go through this, and even in that attempt that was disturbed somewhat. But I have decided how I will proceed, and I brought 3 or 4 different selections that of the way certain men felt in their time about pressing issues. And I think that I will center pretty much on the issues in this country and pretty much the core and central issues that face us in the urban area and urban crisis. And those tend to center around the whole business of race, poverty, and participation in this government. When we talk about dissent, we talk about the business of saying no, rejection, certain things that are unacceptable. And that leads generally not only to the business of very strict, very continuous criticism, but it also leads and should lead to protest. It should lead to organized efforts against that which is perceived clearly wrong. And it should lead to change, social change. And I think this is the takeoff era. This is the one era where there seems to be some question. There are those who say that there should be no change. There are those who say that there should be change, and that perhaps it should be left to evolution. There are those who say that the change should be planned. There are those who say that the change should be rational. There are those who say the change should be revolutionary. Now, there was a philosopher one time who said that take hold of your lives. Most of the things that distress you, you can avoid. Most of the things that dominate you, you can overthrow. You can do as you will with them. And Plato said this a long time ago. And it's been said in different ways before him, and it's been said in different ways since his time. And it's being said today. Take hold of your lives. And when you look around, just and determine where you are, regardless of what particular point you are in society today, and begin to examine that with a critical view. And take a look, rather of one of introspection. Begin to determine who you are and your relationship to the why and wherefore of some great questions. Now I'm going to go through some of the things here that I'm going to read. And they deal with people who found certain things unacceptable to them. The relationships of power, the business of oppression, the business of racism, and the business of being citizens without the rights and without the cloak and the robe of privileges that has been accorded to others because of their race. And I will do this two ways. I will read an establishment viewpoint, and I will read a viewpoint of one who was clearly in disagreement with the establishment. In 1736, there was a man who was the receiver general in Virginia, and he wrote a note to the president of the trustees in Georgia, and it reads as follows. They import so many Negroes here that I fear this colony will sometime or other be confirmed by the name of New Guinea. I am sensible of many bad consequences of multiplying these Ethiopians among us. They blow the pride and ruin the industry of our white people, who seek in the rank of poor creatures below them, detest work, and fear it should make them look like slaves. Then the poverty which ever attends upon idleness, dispose them as much more like a gentleman to steal than to dirty their hands with labor of any kind. There's another statement by a man who was the governor of South Carolina. His name's George McDuffie. And I've got an excerpt from a defense of his of slavery, which his total position was one that he said that slavery should exist, racial slavery should exist throughout the years of all time, and that no white people should ever permit any other such institution to exist. Anyway, I'll read his excerpt. No human institution, in my opinion, is more manifestly consistent with the will of God than domestic slavery. And none of his ordinances is written in more legible characters than that which consigns the African race to this condition, and is more conducive to their own happiness than any other which they are susceptible. Whether we consult the sacred scriptures or the lights of nature or reason, we shall find these truths as abundantly apparent as if written with a sunbeam from heaven. Until the Ethiopian can change his skin, it will be vain to attempt by any human power to make free men of those whom God has doomed to be slaves by all their attributes. Now, I have another excerpt to read. This was by a young black man, Garnett, who made a call to rebellion, being a free black man outside of slavery, and a message directed to black people who were in bondage. And this was his view. 227 years ago, the first of our injured race was brought to the shores of America. They came not with glad spirits to select their homes in the New World. They came not with their own consent to find an unmolested enjoyment of the blessings of this fruitful soil. The first dealings they had with men, calling themselves Christians, exhibited to them the worst features of corrupt and sordid hearts, and convinced them that no cruelty is too great, no villainy, no robbery too abhorrent for even the enlightened men to perform when influenced by avarice and lust. Neither did they come flying upon the wings of liberty to a land of freedom, but they came with broken hearts from their beloved land and were doomed to an unrequited sorrow in deep degradation. Nor did the will of their bondage end at their emancipation by death, nor did the evil of their bondage end at the emancipation by death. Succeeding generations inherited their chains, and millions have come for eternity into time and have returned again to the world of spirits, cursed and ruined by American slavery. There are some more things in that particular thing that I could read, but we don't have to. I'll read another letter to the son of a man who was executed in the United States in 1927. And the letter is from Bartolome Sacco. This is the part of the feelings of this one part of the team of Sacco and Vanzetti, people who were radicals and who were framed and who were executed. But this was his feelings shortly before the time of his death. My dear Dante, I still hope, and we will fight until the last moment to revindicate our right to live and to be free. But all the forces of the state and of the money in reaction are deadly against us because we are libertarians or anarchists. I write little of this because you are now and yet too young to understand these things and other things to which I would like to reason with you. But if you do well, you will grow and understand your fathers in my case and your fathers in my principles, for which we will soon be put to death. I tell you now that all I know of your father, he is not a criminal, but one of the bravest men I ever knew. Someday you will understand what I'm about to tell you, that your father has sacrificed everything dear and sacrificed everything that is sacred to the human heart and soul for his faith and liberty and justice for all. That day you will be proud of your father, and if you will come brave enough, you will take his place in the struggle between tyranny and liberty, and you will vindicate his and our names and our blood. If we have to die now, you shall know, when you will be able to understand this tragedy in its fullest, how good and brave your father has been with you, your father and I, during these 8 years of struggle, sorrow, passions, anguish, and agony. Even from now you shall be good, brave with your mother, with Inez, and with Susie, brave, good Susie, and do all you can to console and help them. I would like you to know and to also to remember me as a comrade and a friend to your father, your mother, and I assure you that neither I have been a criminal, that I have committed no robbery, I have committed no murder, but only fought modestly to abolish crimes amongst mankind and for liberty for all. It's just a couple personal sentiments in terms of trying to get a little bit closer to people in their times, trying to understand how men were able to say certain things and to do certain things, some being on the side of an established power and some being outside of it and operating on a morality, operating on a religion, on a faith, or a system of politics that attempted to define what is right and what is wrong in human existence, what government should be all about, what democracy should be all about, or socialism, or any other form of instrumentality to provide government for men, to provide freedom and liberty, and protect all members of a society. Protect them not only with its customs and its traditions, but with its laws and with its administrators. Now, if you listen a little closely, there are a couple of things that at least come out in this country. Everything wrong that has existed in this country that has suppressed freedom, that has raped humanity, that has violated present and future generations, has been done under the face of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. It has been done in the presence of the organized church. It has been done by people who also proclaim themselves to be Christians. And it has been done by a country who said and continues to say that we are free people. We are the greatest organization of civilization ever witnessed on earth. It has been done with some of the deepest and most vilest hypocrisy that, in my opinion, ever witnessed by man. We talk about political dissent. And we talk about it from the framework of democracy, that everybody has a voice. We talk about majority rule. There are at least two particular theories that I'm concerned with, because these theories, in many ways, are fact and would have maybe a little trouble in terms of strict empirical test, but in terms of what is really happening, what has happened in this country, there is no question about the fact that black people in this country are tyrannized and have been tyrannized by a majority. The Indians and the poor suffer the same fate. But there's something very peculiar about this majority that has oppressed black people, that is oppressive in many forms and spreads itself over the globe. It has been said by some philosophers, where the majority has power, the minority has no rights. And that is a contradiction. That does not represent reality. Because anybody who is associated with those people, or the study of those people, particularly the racists in this country, the open and admitted racists, the people who've been pretty much located in the South, but not entirely, but the people who represented a minority against the abolition of slavery itself were a minority, but in being a minority was able to concoct and get by with one of the meanest tricks that's ever been played on any people. How in the world can any man under any society that has enlightened men in it, who has enlightened men in power, be considered as property? How could slaves be considered as property when you have people like Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Benjamin Franklin, Sam Adams, Tom Paine, and many other people? And this is getting outside of the people like the Randolphs and getting outside of the people who had foreign views to that of liberty. But black people were regarded as property. And the people who were talking liberty, the people who were talking justice, and the people who were talking about breaking ties with England, themselves, in many key and important instances, were the owners of slaves. At the time that Patrick Henry stood in the House of Representatives in Richmond and made that overwhelming and passionate speech about the war and the need for war with England, and said those words, "Give me liberty or give me death." And at the very time he said them, he was the owner himself of slaves, 29 in fact. Thomas Jefferson, in writing the Declaration of Independence, and including in that Declaration of Independence a philippic against slavery, also was the holder of slaves. I was born 1 mile from Monticello, come up under the shadow of all the things that Jefferson said and done that was good, and also came up under to witness the whole business of the slave quarters, to see them, and not understanding entirely what they meant, as I was a young fellow at the time. But the point that I'm making is that men like these were themselves guilty of what they were trying to eliminate. And on the other hand, in setting up a liberty, setting up a freedom that was to be ordered by this country to solve the whole business of the question of freedom and liberty for blacks, all black people became property. And if you're property, you can't dissent. If you're property, you have no voice. But how can one be property? How can one be property and bring yellow, half-white babies into the world? These are some of the things. How can one be a Christian and oppress and abuse and violate humanity, such as was done to black people in this country? And how can one be a Christian and move to another land and declare all of its inhabitants infidels and take away their land, take away their holdings, take away their happiness, take away their liberty, take away their freedom? And it was done. It was done here. And it was done not only by gunpowder in the colonies and later by the Union Army. It was done with tricks such as not being able to conquer the diseases of this country, not being able to conquer the poxes. But when some of the people died over here, some of the white folks died, particularly in the winter, they would throw that diseased blanket out where an Indian could get it or would be tempted to steal it and wipe out small bands of people with disease. These were Christians. Cotton Mather today, who's considered to be one of the best of the early Christians in this country, went on many forays himself. And somehow or another, this was supposed to be mandated by God himself. So this has something to do with what we expect today, and I'll shape this up later, what we expect today by men and a country who profess themselves to be under God and also to be a liberty-loving country. There was no dissent. There was no possibility of dissent. The only dissent was gunpowder. We leave that early period, if we talk about what happened in this country, when there was, in fact, real political dissent, when the great question of slavery came up and was debated hotly for 20 years, and carrying on in 1840 up to about the time it broke out, 1861. There were many things said. The business of succession, nullification, all kinds of withdrawal from the system by the South an effort championed by a man very scholarly, who not only knew the business of democracy, who not only knew the business of representative government, but also had a very, very thorough understanding of socialism as well. And one of the master politicians that this country has ever produced, and that's John Calhoun. Very able man. And what the whole business of the Calhouns, the Websters, and the gentleman from Kentucky who was the great artist of compromise, and other people who stood in the great houses of government in this country, particularly in the Senate, and broke this nation up over what appears to be the question of slavery. And a man who is considered to be a great hero today, President of the United States, a man called Abe Lincoln. When the disagreement and the criticism and the active exercise of dissent led to its ultimate conclusion, that of war, the President of the United States had said that if slavery isn't wrong, nothing is wrong. But if I have to maintain slavery to save the Union, I will do it. And if I have to abolish slavery to save the Union, I would also do it. And that statement has nothing at all to do, in my opinion, with morality. It has nothing to do with a commitment to liberty. It has nothing to do with the belief that all men are created equal. It has all to do with political expediency. It has all to do with setting the precedent, maintaining the customs, carrying out the traditions of superiority of a certain group of people, of an admittance of wrong, that there was no manifest will to change in terms of one particular person, and that in the president itself. However, the war went on, the system broke up over slavery, and it was united again. And in the uniting of the reuniting or reunification of this country after the Civil War, and for a period of some 7 or 8 years, when black people began to come in office, into political office, and when black people and poor whites began to get on together in the South, this system in itself became untenable, became one in which this government, in terms of the people who were concerned with making profits, did not tolerate. And when the Hayes-Tilden Compromise was effected, the institution of domestic slavery being eliminated was replaced with psychological bondage and replaced with another slavery, and it was the tyranny of the laws that set up the segregation society in this country, that separated for all time, supposedly, the blacks and the whites, but doing so under the whole business of states' rights, and doing so with the concurrence and the approval of the United States government. And again, there was no dissent in terms of the black group. The first great statement made after that time was made by Booker T. Washington, who was a great leader in his time, who was accepted by Southerners and whites alike. and he preached the doctrine of acquiescence. And in terms of any real dissent on a national basis, there was none. There were a few people who knew that this was wrong, who continued to try to push forward, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, and people who believed that all men were created equal, people who believed that liberty should exist in this country, being very small in number, carried forth some dissent, but there was no real political dissent over this question. Black people were being lynched every day. Matter of fact, Minnesota also participated in it, with 2 black men lynched in Duluth. And the other part of it, that what was happening, not only to the blacks in this country, but what was happening to poor whites in this country, what was happening to a man who would say that I am better than any nigger, who would put on his white robe, who would get with the people who wore the sheets, who would go through their acts of violence and murder, pillage, and then in the late evening hours return home to a raggedy shack with no groceries, no way of looking about his own condition and seeing anything that was comfortable. Could look about that and say that I'm still better than a nigger. There has been no great dissent even today about the condition that has raped the minds and has so defiled the spirits of low-income whites, particularly low-income whites in the South, that has betrayed all hopes for them to be free and to participate in this society by a racial sickness and disease inculcated and nurtured by the ongoing of a very evil system. Now, there has been no dissent, I maintain, of any strong political force to take that system into account. There hasn't been any real concern and any real compassion, not only in terms of the plight of the blacks, but the plight of the poor whites too. There has been no real dissent, no real political dissent about the plight of the Indian in this country today, who lost a land so vast and so rich and participates in none of it to any extent that has something to do with previous ownership. It has none of it. He has to get permission almost to come into the cities. And he's hustled right back out to the reservations. And it is the most unjust settlement of war that has ever been witnessed in modern times, and probably has very hard and difficult to find any president in antiquity that would justify the Indian, the American Indian, being kept as a prisoner of war right today. And there has been no strong and national political dissent about that. It has only been that small core people who have said it is wrong, who have said I disagree. There have been occurrences from time to time when the dissent has taken national proportions. with the exception of the Civil War, when there were some other factors, strongly economic, involved in that question, and when the settlement of the economic questions were dealt with, and when it was found that those questions could be dealt with and oppression of blacks continued, the healing of the nation was soon accomplished. So I don't think it's fair to consider the Civil War the reason for the Civil War resulting from the great question over slavery in terms of people having any feeling for liberty among black people. Over slavery, yes, but in terms of who was going to make the money and how it was going to be cut up. Low-income whites and whites who are considered to be non-rich, non-wealthy, did have a cause in this country that reached national proportions. And it came in the era of the populist movement. It came when there was a great groundswell about dealing with the establishment. The Knights of Labor were one of the early unions who believed in taking on this establishment. Later, Samuel Gompers came along with the AFL-CIO, and he began his organization. And the style of his organization was one of such that black people were going to be put out, and they were. But the populist movement did attract a very large following in this country. They did get to that particular part of the human spirit that has some degree of excellence to it. There was some hope for a while. There were many people moving. There was a definite jab made to bring about a change in the country. And the dissent was widespread with the existing conditions. And the populists almost won. Their program was incorporated chiefly by the Democratic Party, and some of their leaders were incorporated or re-entered into the Democratic Party, and their movement died. Organized labor, people who fought against sweatshops, who fought against child labor, who wanted the right to collectively bargain, who wanted to do something against the establishment, who wanted to do something against the railroads, who wanted to do something about the packing houses, who wanted to do something about the mine owners, who wanted a gainful wage, so organized and took on the establishment and carried out a fight that pretty much kicked off its intensity in the early 30s, that reached its peak somewhere in the early 50s in terms of strength. And today is one of the most powerful members of the establishment and having a very glorious history in terms of dissent, in terms of action, in terms of carrying out a program of fighting for what they wanted. And after having achieved this, no one hears today, in spite of those who continue to romantically listen and continue to say that labor is going to make a change. In spite of this, you don't hear today from the ranks of organized labor that an injury to one is an injury to all. There's little to be said these days in remembrance of workers of the world unite. There's nothing said today within the ranks of organized labor except the small cry from the UAW, which does try to relate to minority workers, which does try to work to migrant farmers, that does try to look and see what's going on with not only the unorganized, but perhaps also with a little bit to the unskilled. But by and large, that great large group of people that represents the working class of this country, that are represented through unions, have no particular concern on an ongoing basis of bringing the rest of the people in. And there is no real dissent about that. Now, most of the things that happen are political. Most of our organizations, most of the civil rights activities, most of the things that center around social welfare programs, most of the things that we do are political. And some of the things that I have been talking about have been political, not so much as they were the direct property of politics or that they were the direct property of parties, but they were the whole business of political activities going on in this country at one time or another that were dealt with in one way or another, that suffered the fates of compromise, that suffered denial altogether, and once in a while there was some gain made. The question facing the United States today is a question that has faced most societies. The question of whether or not that there is a mandate, that there is a will, that there is a conscience in its people, and a spirit that not only opens itself up to all of its citizens, in that that's supposed to be a given, but there is a mandate that a civilization based on right, truth, and justice will take place, that by example, by demonstration, that our young will have something worth occupying the seats of leadership in a distant or a future age, that the business of produce, that the business of government, that the maintenance of law will be such as to be respected. And great questions come from that. The great democracies of antiquity, centered in Greece, opened up to everybody except their slaves. They believed in democracy. They had slaves, but they had fairness. They produced great minds and great philosophers and great scholars. And our system today, as were over several hundred years ago, is not a potent system, although their ideas are cherished by all people who believe in freedom and representative governments and democracies. The example of structure was set. It was set when Jean-Jacques Rousseau says that all men were born free, and everywhere he is in chains. The structure was set in this country for all people to participate, and we still have those who are unfree. We still have those who are chained. But we have a population of people in this country where the biggest chains are those chains of reason, those chains of conscience, those chains of rightness and fairness and justice. Now, one of the central forms of dissent going on in this country today is provided by young people. One of the central forms of dissent takes place when people take over universities. When they take over the moral halls, the Columbia Universities, Harvards, the Berkeleys, San Francisco States, there is a dissent. And those who followed what happened in Columbia know that before Columbia was sacked and burned, that the students presented the administration with a set of grievances. They wanted a little to say about their education. They wanted the university to be more in touch with the problems of the city. They wanted the university not to overrun Harlem. They wanted the university to be for real. They wanted the university to open up and be on the side of the poor. And the university did not respond favorably. And it was only after the police came. It was only after that the heads were busted. It was only after a community was caught up in a crisis and fear and hostility began to spread. It was only after all of that that the university administration began to meet the grievances and the demands that had been placed before them by the students. This has pretty much been the pattern of protest. This has been a pattern on the campuses, in spite of the questions sometimes of just what some students were trying to do, not raising the questions about the business of SDS, what they were all about, what they are all about, not raising the questions about what the black groups are all about, the students as well as the people who are regarded as militants, not raising any questions, and not looking at anything but demands placed before an administration. The history of this country, in many ways, is the history of Columbia University's response to the students' demands. And it is a principle that showed itself in the Vietnam War, when a great question come up around that city where so many Viet Cong had infested, that the strategy became one that we must destroy the city to save it. And what I'm saying is that as long as there is an idea in government carried on by its administrators that it is wrong to submit to demand of just grievances, that it is wrong to solve a problem before violence, that it is wrong to accede to the wishes of a group of people who may not dress the way that they're supposed to, who may not look the way that they're supposed to. As long as those opinions and those ideas are held, there will always be the Columbias, there will always be the Chicagos, there will always be the Detroits, because there are people in this country, as well as all over the world, who will capture the moment in terms of taking a step toward rightness. There are people who believe in justice. There are people who believe in justice in spite of all things that may be standing against it. They will stand against the police. They will stand against the army. They will stand against the courts. They will stand against unjust laws. They will stand against all that is perceived to be wrong and bad in this country, regardless of what. And those people who are in power, charged with the duty of administering education, searches for truth, jobs, employment, regulating commerce, running the government, whatever, as long as they maintain the policies of unreason, the policies that somehow or another everything is perfect as it is, they will be challenged. There will be dissent. There will be people who take exception. And there will be no rest, and there will be no tranquility. The people in this country today, particularly the young people, have one of the biggest challenges of young people in the history of human civilization. One, because of the great and awesome power that this country has, its entrenched power, its entrenched policies, its tremendous wealth, and those people who have the ability to manipulate it. And those people who continually say that I'm the one. Put my program in, and I will take care of America. Watch me, like President Nixon is saying. The responsibility being in terms that we have a man who has just been elected president and has began to challenge all the activities, all of the protests, all of the civil rights movements, challenge all of the works that have come out of those particular activities, and began to roll back and attempt to roll back the programs that address the needs of the people who are poor, people who are black, and the next part probably will be the people who are aged. There have been 3 men in our time, 3 very great and excellent men, 3 men who brought out the best in America, who have been shot down, have been put away with all of the ceremony and the respect, with all of the proper mourning, and their graves are not cold. And we have the system trying to go back to business as usual. This is what they're telling the young. This is what they're telling the intellectuals. This is what they're telling the black. This is what they're telling the poor. That the interest of this country is not in the interest of justice for everybody. It is not in the interest of sharing and charity. It is not in the interest of Christianity as written, but it's only in the interest of those in power, those who intend to keep, and those who refuse to share. Now, I say the challenge is on the young, because the young are the ones who are most active. The young tend to be the ones who understand in terms of what it means to have a commitment. And the young are pretty much those who are on the field of action. Those who are liberals and intellectuals have run the course many times before, have instructed, and have tried, but sometimes offer no direction. Sometimes they become quiet like they did in the Prohibition era. Sometimes they drop out of sight like during parts of the McCarthy era. And sometimes, like the present, it is hard to maintain strong liberal sentiment, good and proper direction. And especially when the men who take the stand, the men who harness or attempt to harness the goodness, those who believe in the rightness, those who talk about justice for the poor, for the black, liberation. And when the only people die in this country are the heroes, perhaps in some way or not, you can see why it's difficult to maintain the strength and the vigor within the enlightened community as necessary. But what I say is this, is that this country doesn't have much time to do right. There are some people who are capable of doing the things that Martin Luther King did, and Malcolm X did, and John Brown did, and Viola Liuzzo did. And some people are capable of doing the things that the Bobby Kennedys and the McCarthys and the SEALs and the militants and the radicals. There are some people capable of doing this and carrying out this style of activity. But there are many more who are untouched by the necessity to move and to act. There are many who are not in the struggle on an active basis. There are many who cannot understand what the takeover of Morrill Hall was all about. And if you try to compare Morrill Hall with Columbia University, you would have to stretch reality, you would have to stretch fact, you would have to stretch the truth. But the hostility that emerged around Minneapolis and the hostility in Minnesota on that takeover was so thick and so heavy and so vicious, you would have thought that Morrill Hall, Augsburg College, and almost every other college or institution of learning in this city was burned down. The reaction against that type of thing. And that's the reaction, and that's the idea that we have to deal with. Because that reaction is very pervasive. It's the same reaction that one gets when he applies to be an apprenticeship in a trade union. If he's black or if he doesn't have a friend. It's the same reaction that the poor gets when they want low-income housing, when they want a decent job. It's the same reaction that is gotten and received by those who are trying to carry out the mandate of the United States. And when they confront a very strict and terrible power, when they confront those who just will not bend, the reaction is hostile, it is terrible, it is crushing, and it causes many people to stay at home. I believe that there's only one place to be, and that's at the center of action. I believe that as long as there's a law in this country that is not complied with, that deals with the business of upholding the rights and liberties of people, that there's going to be continued trouble. I believe where justice is denied, and that the truth is made known, that there are men who will not accept this, there are women who will not accept this. And I believe that there is a God, and I believe that He would instruct all who profess to believe in Him, that when the great question comes between the selection of allegiance to the flag of one's country or to the cross that one must bear, I believe that He would instruct that you would take your cross. And I think that that's what it's all about in the country today. I think at too many times one is forced to choose between what he knows to be right, what he feels is right for others, against the business of participating in a system that is wrong and oppressive. And I believe that too many of us are not necessarily making the wrong decision, but the decision of inaction, no decision, abstaining, waiting for future clearness, waiting for some great mandate, waiting for perhaps even a vision. There are too many people doing that today. At no time in my life will I ever deviate from a principle of fairness, a principle that respects all men, and a way of life and a program that will admit all men who are able to be fair and to respect all people. And on the other hand, at no time in my life will I permit this country, this government, or any other power to force me to do that which is wrong, to force me to not take a stand for right, to force me into non-existence and the perpetration of any type of scheme that is wrong and evil. I say to you, and I'll close now, that the business of freedom and justice in this country is going to be fought a few more years. Evil as I believe the president of this country to be, I don't believe the world is going to come to an end because too many people are yet going to sit on the sidelines. But the battle is still going to be waged. It's still going to be fought. And one of the good things that has happened in this country today is that more people are beginning to understand that it's not just a question surrounding black people. It's not just a question surrounding the Indians. It's not just a question surrounding the poor. But it's a question surrounding all of us in this country who believe that humanity must prevail, that justice must be available for everybody, that law must be complied with by all, and if it isn't, all are suppressed, all are oppressed, and it's a matter of time before this type of thing goes into a festering sore and will break out. There are those who are aware of this. There are those who are black who are recognizing that in pulling together a black position, that the next step is to move with people who are able to operate on a total program. There are those who know that there are, like I said before, the John Browns. And what I'm talking about is the ability of people to act on the right cause. There are those now who are becoming more concerned with the plight of the poor and with the plight of the Indian. And that the dissent that's necessary will have to be put on the field of action. It will have to remain on the field of action. It will have to remain there in the highest form of activity to prevent any more martyrs. We don't need anyone else crucified for the cause that we believe in. And the only way that we can prevent the reoccurrences of the assassinations of the Kennedys, Martin Luther Kings, and the others who have died, the only way that we can prevent the crucifixions of those men is by all of us being on the field of action. And to the extent that we are not there, they will be claimed, and it will be true then, that every generation needs a Christ. And if every generation needs a Christ and demands a Christ, then somehow or another, we are not going to make it. Because Jesus came a long time ago. There has been one essential crucifixion, and that is enough. It is up to us now to move toward that end, to move with passion, to move with fire, to move with truth. And that is one of the reasons I come here today to pass this message over to you. I hope that somehow or another that you can take hold of it, and that those things that you knew to be right before you came in here, those things that you know have to be done for this country to be straightened out, that you won't sit on it, and you won't let your candle be covered by a bushel, that you will, in fact, let your light shine, that you will take the step, and that you will take it without fear. You will take it with active commitment. And whether you be praised or whether you be damned, that you carry that with the faith of righteousness. You carry that in recognition of the efforts of the men and women and generations who've gone on before you. And you take that, not knowing whether you'll be joined, but you will be. And to the extent that you do it and continue it and maintain it, that is the reason and justification of faith that we have in terms of our ability to overcome evils. And that's what I will do. That's what I have done and I will continue to do. And I hope that you will too. And thank you so much.